Welcome to Man Down Podcast. My name is Ted Knudsen, and we are here to wreak havoc on your life in the very best way. I am joined today by Patrick Van Straten. Hello, Patrick.
Hello. Nice to see you again.
So, our purpose here, for those of you who are encountering us the first time, is to sort of talk about men's wellness and have intimate conversations in a way that you often never hear from men. So, we're going to talk about topics that are interesting to us and that should be interesting to you. In many ways, we're going to give you tactical perspectives on how to gently improve your life or the life of your friends. And the hope is that, well, the reality is you guys pushed us to do this podcast because you were excited about the ideas. You haven't seen it. Every single person that I've talked to that's a man is like, wow, that doesn't exist anywhere else. And I think you guys will be really successful. So hopefully we're not idiots and we pull this off and we are really successful. But even if we're not, we're going to have fun ourselves.
Yeah. And I think, we would want everybody to know that we're thinking through this stuff as we go as well. When you come to this podcast, yeah, we might have had some previous background in it. We might have done some work on ourselves, but we are probably going to disagree at times. We're probably going to give each other different perspectives, and we want your perspectives as well. So if you have any comments, then please do drop them below, because we'd love to hear your ideas for future episodes, but also your thoughts on what we're talking about. It can be more of a community space.
And since you provoked us and it's your fault that we're doing this, we expect you. It is part of your commitment to us that you're going to tell your friends, your girlfriends, your wives, whomever else you know, if you love us, that they should listen to us too, because hopefully, we're providing stuff that's useful for them.
Yeah. And so today, should we say what we're talking about?
I would hope so. It'd be hard to talk about it without mentioning it.
It'd be interesting to see if we could. Today, we're going to talk a bit about radical honesty. So there is a specific movement with this name, right? Which is based on a book by a guy called Brad Blanton. And the foundational idea is that there is too much dishonesty in our lives, both dishonesty with ourselves and with other people. And that over time, from the time that we're children, we learn to lie, to conceal parts of ourselves that we've been socialized to think are unacceptable. And over time, this creates internal disconnection. This creates guilt, shame, and it also affects our relationships with other people, because we're maybe not entirely sure what we want from them. We're maybe not completely above board when we're talking to them. So I think it's an interesting idea, and radical honesty proposes that the best way to go about this is to do full internal inventory, work out what's really going on inside you, and then to try to be more honest in your relationships with other people. There are different grades of this. At one end, there are people who think even a lie of omission is a lie that we cannot brook under this system, and others who say it's mostly an inward looking thing. Ted, I think this is really, I think this is a topic that you were more interested in than I was going into this, but I found it very interesting to think about. What's your history with radical honesty?
So I have found over time, and actually, I think my CEO period was probably the most intense version of this. So when you're CEO of a company, like, you have to obfuscate everything for the good of the company. Like that is how I was taught to do it. Now, that's not necessarily true in the world of social media, where CEOs can be bombastic and have drug problems and eventually take over the government. I would suggest that those people are pretty unique even now, and not always convincing investors to spend lots of money on things unless you've already had massive success. But for me, I felt my speech was incredibly spectacularly constrained and censored by having this role. And so I had a company that I built from scratch with lots of other people, so it wasn't just me. And yeah, like that was an 8-year journey where I had to be like very quiet about everything going on in my life. And I found that to be quite painful, because some people inside of the company were my friends. I could tell them some things, I could not tell them other things. But even beyond that, when I came back out into the dating space and into the rest of the world, I was like, it feels like I need to be much more upfront about what I'm interested in, what I believe in, and to also be honest about people, right? To, like, in the positive ways. So, like, telling somebody that I love them, even if they might be uncomfortable with it. I'm all right with that. I'll accept that type of stuff exists. Being more honest with my children about being a real person as opposed to just being a role. Like, that was pretty big. And then being quite honest and upfront with potential partners about things that I believe in. And we'll talk about some elements of that, I think are where I ended up as like the good side. But it all starts with the thing that you mentioned initially, which is you got to figure out what the hell's going on inside of you. You got to figure out what you believe in. And I kind of liken it to the old school thing where man's got to have a code.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing then is we all imagine that we're constantly in dialogue with ourselves and that we're really listening to what we want. And it's,
Some of us are definitely talking to ourselves all the time. And some people don't have internal monologues. And you find that out and you're like, holy
yeah,
shit, how
that's
do you
true.
interact with the world?
I don't understand that at all. But you can have an internal dialogue without really being honest with yourself, right? You know, we've all been in that situation before where you've thought about something and you think, oh, you know what, I actually can't face the reality of that.
Yeah.
And that's where you can see that not only do you need to discuss this with yourself, but that there also is room for some compassion there. There's something that you're judging yourself for.
That's the other critical component that gets lost. I think compassion and forgiveness for yourself is the
Hmm.
thing that has to go along with this. Because if you're just radically honest all the time, and actually, if you're sort of an anxious person or an overthinking person, like if you make mistakes, man, you could just be absolutely fucking brutal. And the reality is, humans will all make mistakes. And so if you have the wrong expectations for yourself and you can't forgive yourself, you end up in like a living box of hell because you're like,
Hmm.
oh, this was my fault. And maybe it can be, and I should never have done this. Well, maybe you shouldn't have, but like the past is the past. Can you learn? Can you move on? Can you do better? Can you perhaps apologize, make up for it? But back to the principle in general. So, principle of radical honesty and being radically honest with yourself about who you are, what you want in your life, and then starting to carry yourself forward in that way and interact with life more so honestly than you have before, I think is super crucial. I think it's really important. And it doesn't have to be this concept. If you went back to just going to therapy and being like self-centered, not self-centered in the negative projection, but self-centered in this is who I am, this is how I want to interact with the world, like
Hmm.
that's a super valuable place to start. But the only place that you can actually start and start succeeding is to be honest and very truthful about that.
Yeah. So this is the thing. When we're not really aware of what's going on inside us, then we do tend to react. We're not acting intentionally. And so the idea is here that by being honest with ourselves, we will be able to be more authentic. And it doesn't even need to have a kind of external action associated with it in order for you to see the benefit of this, right? We all know that we carry around guilt and shame for stuff that other people probably wouldn't think much of if they knew about it. And even, for example, if say you were in a committed monogamous relationship, but when you really thought about it, you wanted to have sex with other people, you don't necessarily have to go and act on that. But it's worth knowing that, even if it keeps you away from situations where you might act on it without kind of planning to. So all this kind of self-knowledge is going to help you make the choices that you want to make rather than being kind of having this little person in your head like driving you around like Ratatouille style, which is how it can feel when we're not really connected to our emotions, I think.
So we're talking about the self, but then there's the other side of it, which is interacting with other people.
Hmm.
You should be really careful about that because there's a whole spectrum. But I think that interacting with other people and being more honest about that sooner is quite valuable because a lot of times we will soften information. A lot of times we will gentle information that might be crucial for the other person. Say somebody's being a racist asshole or a homophobic asshole, like anything that is negative that should clearly be interacted with from a friendship perspective in a way that sort of lends them to be corrected. Like you should be pretty upfront about like, hey, that's not okay. And you should find the
Mm.
right phrases and the right words to be able to do that. But plenty of times people just duck, right? They're like, oh, that's just Tim. That's just that guy or that girl.
Mm.
And that impacts you because you were a connected person associated with that. And in many ways, we are a combination of our closest connections, but it also impacts them too. And plenty of people grew up in ignorance. And so that
Hmm.
level of ignorance needs to be pushed along by interacting with the world in a better way. Also, you can get feedback that tells you that you might be better educated. So I think that in those ways it's super useful. But what you shouldn't do is tell the bald truth objectively from your perspective every single moment, because
Yeah.
one, you're potentially wrong, And you need to go in with the priority that says that I could be wrong on a somewhat regular basis at times. I might not understand the perspective. I haven't lived through it and don't have all of the information to be able to do that. And two, like, you need to have connections. And if you just walk up to people, I kind of find it to be the Raylan Givens treatise on
Sure.
like, if you meet an asshole in the morning, you just met an asshole. But if you walk through your day and everyone you meet is an asshole, then you're the asshole. that
Yeah.
I think is pretty important for people to know. And again, you have to be honest about like what you're seeing in your world and how that's impacting you.
Yeah, I think this is where I start to find my sympathy for this perspective
Mm.
break down, right? Because there's definitely a temptation for certain people to see anything less than brutal honesty as a betrayal of self. They get locked into this idea of a certain kind of intellectual authenticity, which means I say what I think all the time, and it normally is brutal, and it often is biased towards the negative, and it ignores the fact that the whole purpose of this, what you end up with is a distorted teleology, right? So you start off with the mindset that the point of what we're doing is to be more at peace with myself
Mm-hmm.
and to promote connection with others, and thereby to produce more like human flourishing. But over time, I think it's very easy to start thinking the honesty is the point, and then you're going to say any old shit you want because you're not thinking about that broader goal, which is this is a tool for self-knowledge and connection to others.
Right. Can I find my people faster is another way
Yeah.
to look at it. And the other way to, so the gentling of that, the more correct perspective is, if I'm trying to find my people faster, there are, tactical paths to be able to do that. And being an
Mm-hmm.
asshole and telling things exactly as it must be, like, maybe there's a way that you can phrase that would be a little gentler. Maybe you can change your tone of voice to say that this might be a better way to think about something. And so when you figure out like the wrapping of the package and the gift that you're trying to give, like, that is really important. And plenty of times people aren't ready to hear stuff. And if you know them really well, you can plant seeds, but you can't just like barge in and be like this, because like so often that gets rejected. So if your purpose in life is much more about how do I impact and influence these things more than how do I live the perfect, objective, honest life, like, it does change your vectors and how you phrase these things, how you interact with other people.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, with yourself, as we said, there's also a gentling where, yes, you can be
Yeah.
totally honest about everything all the time. But if you are that way and you make any mistake whatsoever, like, it can just tear you apart. And if you're the person that's constantly tearing yourself down, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're creating a life of misery. And there are so many times where, more anxious people, but also people that are avoidant, and then it comes back to bite them, they will talk negatively to themselves throughout their whole life, maybe because their parents did. And that's the sort of framing and the mental voices that they hear. And how you talk to yourself is not only important to like your self-image, it's literally important to your physical health. And
Mm-hmm.
if you have, if you learn how to speak to yourself more gently, if you learn how to be honest, but then find ways to forgive yourself and improve, like, then you will probably have a better life externally with all the connections that you might make, but you also have a better mental internal life that leads to better wellness and better health.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of us kind of just apply the stick with ourselves and never really the carrot. I say this a lot to my clients. I may have said it on one of the previous episodes, and my clients are very bored of hearing it. But a lot of us imagine that the voice in our head is our best friend. It's been there our whole life. It's been there our whole life. And there are people I know who say, "Well, I talk to myself about this, and I kind of," and it's almost like that's a friend of theirs. And I think that's the cruelest person you know. That's the person who says all they know everything about you. But they have absolutely no filter, and there's often zero compassion, and people don't realize how there's this one voice in their head repeating the most negative stuff again and again and again
Yes.
all day long, and there's no countervailing voice. There's nobody offering the alternative opinion, because that negative viewpoint is just an opinion
So
and it's not the truth.
I'm going to tell you the cultural pushback against that. So if
Mm,
you figure out like your good traits and the things that you do well and the things that you're valuable, and then you voice those,
Hmm.
in comparison to everybody else, you sound like you're arrogant or you've got a big head or you're like overly confident.
American, like you're American.
Absolutely. And actually, oftentimes people come to America and they're like, it's so refreshing. Like people are much
Sure.
more positive about stuff. They're more this. I mean, it's scary at times too. And like there's plenty of negativity about Americans. We're loud. But also being a little more positive is so much better for your life. Like Charlie Munger was asked, like, what is the one thing that you would wish for your children? Like this billionaire guy that worked with Warren Buffett, super thoughtful. His both Buffett and Munger's readings are fantastic from a business perspective, but also a philosophy perspective. And he's like, the one thing I would wish for my children is to be optimists, because
Hmm.
like optimism is such a positive factor in people's lives, and thinking the future can be better and not
Yeah.
constantly talking negatively about it. So one, can you be optimistic about your future? Can you look forward
Mm.
to the potential partners or the potential jobs or the potential things that you might encounter in the future? That's wonderful. That's fabulous. And very rarely do pessimistic people create wonderful things in the world because they can't see it, right? Like there's this thing of like status quo around pessimism, versus optimism is like, oh, what can I create in a positive way in my life or other people's lives? Internally, if you do an honest inventory of yourself and what you're good at, like it can help you. And also, you should check this with other people to make sure that you're not completely crazy about it. But it can help you sort of bat back when people are hypercritical of you or tearing you down in different ways.
Mm.
Now, this is true for the internet era and social media era, where sometimes you will get unexpected backlash for no reason. But it's also true just for self talk or in your relationships and your partnerships. Sometimes when things go wrong, like you will have somebody that cares very deeply for you. So they're all the way inside of your trust wall, and they will say horrible things to you and about you.
Mm.
And they're not necessarily the truth. And they're not necessarily reflective of your impact upon the world or them. They're lashing out because of hurt. You have to have some sort of centered sort of principle, code, and sense
Yeah.
of self to be able to continue to exist through that.
Hmm. So I want to park a little bit of that because
There's
I
a
think we
lot.
want to
Yeah.
come to it as its own thing in a bit. But when we're talking about doing an inventory, um, some of it might be going through places where there's resistance. So if you are feeling guilt or shame around something, this is a good place to start digging with yourself. But when we're talking as well about trying to have a more compassionate form of self talk, yeah, thinking about what you're good at is a really good way.
Mm.
Another way to do it might be to write down all the characteristics that you would look for in a friend or a partner, and then go through it honestly and say, how many of these do I have? Because a lot of people, if you said, are you good at X or Y thing, or are you attractive or something, they'd find it really easy to say no. But it's actually quite hard to lie to yourself, to tell yourself you're not a kind person or a considerate person if you genuinely are. And that is not only a way of seeing what you can really do, but it's also a kind of north star for you. When I had this interaction with this friend, was I being the kind of person that I aim to be? I think that's a really, really helpful way to kind of guide yourself back to your own ideas of what's important.
No, I completely agree with that. And so, we started with radical honesty as a principle, and like how should you walk through the world? And most of us, like, also, I think you and I in particular, subscribe to the philosophy, don't be an asshole, right? I mean,
Hmm.
that, or don't be a dick. Like these are good phrases in life. And if you find yourself being an asshole on a regular basis, you're too far on the other side of that. That's a really good heuristic for finding out, like, am I interacting with the world in the right way? Like, yes, you can be
Hmm.
radically honest with yourself. Yes, you can be more honest with your friends, your family, people that you want to interact with in the world. But am I being an asshole is kind of the line where that you don't want to draw on yourself all the time.
Yeah, just seeing radical honesty as a means to an end, I think is the best thing. And if you keep that end in mind, comfort with myself, inner harmony, more compassion for the people around me, more honest, functioning relationships, then it will be hard for you to deviate too much, I think. So, what I want to ask you is, to what extent do you practice radical honesty? How much is this, I guess, a conscious part of your behavior on the daily?
I think that I had to actively change how I constantly did little white lies or
Sure.
obfuscate things about myself. So in many cases, say that you're dating multiple people and you're upfront about, your dating intentions currently.
Hmm.
Then someone's like, "Oh, are you free on Friday?" And you're like, "Oh, I'm seeing friends." right? But like the reality is, I've got a date with this person, and I've got a first date, or I've got a this, or I've got that, and some of my dating has been people who are interested in monogamy. Some of my dating has been people who are interested in E&M open. Some of it's like just unknown, and you go into that. We have lots of thoughts about this, and I'm open to everything in the future. I have been happily monogamous. I would have been happily monogamous in my most recent relationship that lasted a while, that unfortunately I screwed up. But I'm also comfortable with other people having other perspectives. But we constantly do little lies about this, right?
Yeah.
And trying to be honest is actually hard. It's hard in those situations. And it's the same way with your parents or this or that. I'm also trying to give people more direct feedback on how they made me feel, or to ask them how I made them feel. Because these are things in England in particular that you do not hear. Like, I feel like this when we talked the other day, and unfortunately that, made this thing. Or I felt like maybe you were uncomfortable about thing that I said. I was not intentionally being that way. Would you like to talk about it? Right? You're trying to create these moments that are more genuine and honest so that you can build deeper connections. And it's hard if you are not practicing it and not a little bit thoughtful about it, because you will have gotten used to walking through your life and just being like, oh, I never tell the truth really in almost any situation, because that's just how we operate.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll actually touch on this a little bit when we talk about dating. But yeah, generally speaking, people don't know where boundaries are if you don't put them in place. So you have to show them where the boundary is. And it's very easy to start off trying to seem a certain way and then realize over time that you're playing a role.
Mm-hmm.
And you only start to notice when you get that feeling like you're in a shop full of ornaments, one of those ones with the glass shelves where there are like just dozens of them, and you go in and you feel like Ronnie Coleman, where you just think you're going to knock everything over. That
I
you
have
start to feel
boxed
that.
myself into this thing accidentally via my past behavior and conversation.
Yeah. There's another part of it as well, which is that it does take away your self-control over time. So I talked about it the other week. I went to an all-boys school, and in my all-boys school, there's a real tendency to be brutal. And this kind of made for quite a lively intellectual environment. And then in sixth form, girls were allowed into our school. And I was doing philosophy A level, AS and A level. And suddenly we're in this subject where we are meant to be debating things that often are quite close to our hearts. And it was a mixed group for the first time. And the first few weeks of this were absolute carnage, because the boys would steam into debates as brutally as they could. Like, what I need to do is give you enough blood loss that you can't survive more than 5 minutes in this debate.
Boy pack behavior is alpha, alpha, alpha. And it's been that way since the start of time. And it still exists this way in highly charged boy environments. I worked with and hired and hung around Magic players all the time, who are both, for the most part, autistic and brutal and men. So we take your boys club or your boys school, and then we just elevate that to like the maximum extent. And then you get those guys to try and interact with a normal company because they're part of the trading group. Oh my God. And the same thing happened at Smart Odds, where like I saw them as part of the syndicate or part of the traders who were doing stuff, and they would need to interact with IT and these other groups that were much more normal in terms of the population. And it was so hard for them to get along in ways that were effective, because they did not know how to soften their language, and they were only brutal all the time.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, this is exacerbated as well when you have a blend of cultures, because different cultures have different expectations of how straightforward you ought to be. But I had to kind of train myself out of this way of thinking, and I got much, much, much gentler, and I ended up feeling like I'd gone too far the other way. And some of
that's why you're a therapist.
Yeah, and when I was training as a therapist, I was training in a group of kind of 25 people. There were 5 men in the group, and I said to myself, I know what I'm like in a group. I know I like to talk. I know I have a high opinion of my own ideas, but I'm here to learn from other people. And so I can't try and dominate this group.
Right.
And I ended up taking too much of a backseat, to the point that one of my friends said to me, no, we're all here to learn from each other, and you owe me your thoughts.
That's really good self-discipline on your part, though.
Well, yeah, but it was like, there was something naive about it, right? Because I hadn't really thought about what I was doing, I just kind of shut it off entirely, as opposed to thinking, well, why do I need the attention in this group? Or why do I think that everyone would benefit from my opinion here?
Some of the best people you will ever learn from are your smartest peers, but in moderation, right?
Yeah, definitely. But it was interesting. It was an interesting experience. And it's only over the last few years that I've started going back a bit the other way, because I think I became so, I was trying not to be an asshole to such a degree that actually I would have these explosions. I would be holding myself back to such an extent that it was only when my dam was kind of overmatched that I would suddenly, I would just go, I would have no control. So, for example, I'd be sitting in the cinema, someone would be talking, and I'd say, just leave it, ignore it, just leave it. And I would only eventually say something when I was so angry that what I would say would be, shut the fuck up. Or I told somebody they shouldn't be allowed to have kids, that kind of thing. Like, these sorts of things where I was kind of like, well, I'm not happy with how I reacted to this, but it's because I was not being honest with myself,
Yeah.
and I was not having the balls to just say, can you stop making a noise?
And that's a very common set of behaviors. Like
Yeah.
you suppress, and then you explode. And that's really negative. And often that can lead to like violent outbursts, not just, like verbally, but physically as well. So super careful, especially for men. That's like a really common thing that you've got to be aware of. Being more honest with yourself, a big deal, but then like interacting a little more honestly with the world. Doesn't have to be full brutal honesty, but a little more honestly it is so important for people. And I have a follow-up question on this though.
Okay.
Do you meditate?
I have done. I don't do it daily, but occasionally.
So for me, I don't specifically meditate because I view that as an act, right? Like you're like doing whatever it is that you need to do to specifically meditate. But I do have time where I'm meditative, and I think that those are two different. So I have time where I'm really thoughtful, and probably right now I have too much time where I'm really thoughtful, and that's that is a life balance thing that I'm working on. But the act of like walking your dog, super valuable for being able to think through and sort out your day. The gym, often, like if I'm not listening to a podcast, if I just have music that I know, like the gym is a pretty good time for me to be able to be thoughtful about whatever is going on, often about myself, my interactions with my friends, my partners. And then, it used to be business time as well. So like, let me chew on and work on this type of thing. And then the other thing that I do nowadays is sauna. And lots of people are like, oh, I need to find things to do in the sauna. I'm finally to the point where I don't find things to do in the sauna. Like, I'm not listening to music. I'm not listening to anything. You can put your phone on the floor, and like you can, if you're by yourself in like a small sauna, you can do that. You can't read on it. Your phone will get too hot. You can't listen to stuff because your earbuds get too hot. Like if you got the sauna right. But yeah, I can spend like 20, 25 minutes in there in like total silence and think about stuff and be able to work through and process things. Creating thoughtful time, and it's super hard for you because you're in the midst of kids and career and everything else, and I've been there, and I know exactly how difficult and how overwhelming that is. But no matter what, creating thoughtful time, even if it's just a 15-20 minute walk with your dog or your spouse partner, where you can be thoughtful, is so important for creating a balance, because it gives you the time and space to honestly reflect on whatever's going on. And so many times the explosions or the shutdowns happen when you don't have time for that, or you refuse to do that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I don't think people necessarily do it actively, including me. When I go to my in-laws, my father-in-law has a hot tub. And so I will go and sit in the garden in the hot tub, and that is this time for me. Bouldering used to be it for me when I had a bouldering wall near me. But actually, a thing I've started doing now is I will put my earbuds in. Quite often when I have my earbuds in, I'll just stop listening to something at some point because I've started thinking about something else. And now I will just talk out loud as if I'm on the phone to somebody, because everyone just assumes you are on the phone to somebody. And sometimes I just need to get it out. So I'll just talk it through. And probably something that I would have found embarrassing or whatever when I was in my 20s, but now I'm in my mid 30s. It's just, I don't really care.
Yeah. And that's, we're going to, so many of these episodes are going to be filled with like little pieces of truth, but people think about you way less than you ever think they do. Like they don't focus on you. They're focused on their own shit, because like, when you look around, like nobody really cares what's going on. Like, as long as you're not
Yeah.
completely insane. And so finding ways to walk through your life to create more genuineness and more thoughtfulness and more honesty in yourself is super crucial. Now, I wanted to bring up a second thing that sounds very similar to radical honesty, but I think is
Hmm.
not. And I think it's actually really important to understand because I've been encountering this myself for the last couple of years, more so than I ever thought of it. And then I've been reading up on it. I want to talk about sort of what I call the concept of two truths. But you have a different name for this.
Well, I would think of this as often when you get into a disagreement with somebody, it feels like it's their version versus your version, and it ends up feeling like it's me versus you. And when you're in a relationship, any kind of relationship, you it's better to try and see it as a relationship problem, so us versus the problem. And
Mhm.
that's a really, really difficult thing to do, but if you can work on it, suddenly things get much easier. You stop feeling isolated and you start understanding that you both have part of the truth, but neither one of you has a monopoly on it.
Right. So the way that I wanted to explain it was, and this is true for relationships that are romantic. This is true for your friends. This is true for your parents sometimes, and it's certainly true in the workplace. And there are actually different sort of levels and frequencies that it occurs because these things have different levels of attachment or love or trust involved in them. But the concept for me is effectively we walk through our life, and you find this in all the research about eyewitness accounts. We walk through our lives and we are perfectly capable of experiencing something right next to somebody else that factually we disagree on what happened in front of us.
Hmm.
And this is a normal occurrence and it's very widely replicated. You could think that that guy, because you didn't see him properly or because you didn't focus on that particular thing, you could think that he is tall and white and Nordic looking, and another person thinks that he's small and brown skinned and whatever. And the fact is, then you need to
Hmm.
actually have a photographic representation of this. Now, this is like, something that you can find as fact or truth. But in many cases, we walk through our lives and our experiences are colored by emotion and what we were experiencing at the time, what mood we were in at the time, how we felt someone treated us. It doesn't necessarily reflect what the reality was. It reflects
Hmm.
your experience of it. So in the
Hmm.
occupation, like often your goal as a company is to produce, higher returns for shareholders, increase the stock price, make profits, whatever. And your goal as an individual is to, hopefully have a good work-life balance, to make as much money as possible, maybe put yourself in line for promotion, whatever success looks like for your occupation. And someone next to you, hopefully has similar goals, but not often identical ones. And because there's not a ton of trust, because you might even be competitive with each other, there will be times when you're just like, look, I know that you're this person and I've worked with you for many years and that's fine, but like I just don't like you, and so like I don't have to agree with anything that you say in a meeting
Hmm.
or even about the company goals, or I actually can disagree with you if there's no notes on it on what happened in this meeting, and then we have to figure out like here and there, like one-to-ones or whatever. And so that's the most basic one, because you two are presumably having these shared experiences and you have many of the same shared goals, but you're not agreeing on a factual representation of reality because you're experiencing
Hmm.
differently and you might have different goals. That's a really basic level of it. But the thing that I've encountered is I've been shocked at times by people that I have been in love with, that we have created this shared experience, this shared romance, this shared trust. When you get to the other side of it and things are now in the breakup period or the divorce period or the dissolution period, or even when they're really rough, you will then find that you no longer have a willingness to create that shared experience. And so many times you have this one person that was with you and had your back, and you could find agreement on stuff even when they seem quite challenging. And you get to the other side of the trust wall where you fell in love with a rose, you only get the thorns.
Hmm.
And you can no longer agree on many very basic representation of factual situations because they're so colored by emotion of either what happened
Hmm.
or what their current emotional state is, that doesn't exist anymore. And as me as a person, and I don't think this is actually true for a lot of people, but me as a person, like I objectively want to know the truth in most situations. Like I
Hmm.
want to know, like, because I want to be honest with myself. And so by being truthful and honest with myself, if I acted in a negative way or a way that was unintentional, hurtful, or anything like that, I want to know. But I kind of have to know like what the almost objective truth is there, right? So I need to be honest about that. And in a relationship, if it dissolves, I can still be very honest and loving about everything that happened throughout it. It doesn't color the past that we had and we built. It's just, oh, this is the now. And this is a little bit what you say about it's us versus the problem. When there's no longer an us, the problems get much bigger.
Yeah.
I've found that really hard.
Okay, so finding that you're suddenly alone in the issue, and not only that, you kind of feel like you have an enemy.
Exactly. Like some people, I think, actually have to learn to hate the person that they love in order to create a moment or a reason to dissolve it, and to allow themselves to move on, or to allow themselves to, find something to get rid of it, to get rid of the hurt, to get rid of the pain. They're like, oh, well, if I can find hate, and this is not conscious. I don't think that's conscious, but by finding something hateful or negative or something extreme dislike, then it allows them to put that thing in a place where they can deal with it.
Yeah. Well, it feels much easier when you've got a monster, right? Than when you realize that the other person is maybe not the villain, and there might be, I guess it's a tortured phrase, but wrong on both sides. I mean, I think in a lot of relationships, we imagine that we are thinking deductively when we are not. We're thinking inductively or abductively. So a basic way of looking at this, for people who don't know about this, but I imagine most of our listeners do, deductive reasoning would be like, Ted is a bachelor, all bachelors are men, therefore Ted is a man. And the way this tends to look in a relationship is, my partner never empties the dishwasher. And emptying the dishwasher would be a sign of effort and an act of investment in the relationship. Therefore, my partner isn't invested in the relationship.
There you go.
And so you think that so the way deductive reasoning works is that the conclusion is necessarily true. It's entailed by the premises. But often the premises are false, or the conclusion is a little bit wonky. And what we're actually doing most of the time with other people is abduction, which is inference to the best explanation. We're guessing at what's going on with them. Or induction, which is we're taking an example from the past and applying it as if it's universal. So let's say you have an argument with your partner, and in the middle of it, they get up and walk away. And I've had this, and this may trigger the fuck out of you.
I have had this, and you and I, yes, absolutely. Go ahead. Tell me yours, and I'll tell you mine.
Oh, it just absolutely enrages me, because in the moment, I'm just like, you don't care. I'm trying to get to the other side of this problem, but you're not interested. You just want to get out of here. I care more about this than you do. I care more about the relationship than you do. And actually, what you're probably, or a version of this might be, well, when I was a kid and I was upset, my parents would walk away because they didn't care. And so now, if my partner walks away in the middle of an argument, then that means they don't care.
Yeah.
But of course, they could be overwhelmed, or they could have heard the baby cry, or their phone could be ringing, or, they don't understand how much the issue matters to you, or whatever it might be. There are all sorts of other reasons. And we don't necessarily think, well, I'm guessing at their motivation here, and I'm normally guessing at it with a negative bias because I'm pissed off. We think my interpretation is the one true interpretation, and we do start to think we have a monopoly on truth. And at that point, that person in front of you is your enemy, and they're no longer your ally against the issue.
That's right. So in a past relationship, the person that I was with was an outstanding arguer. And they were able to put things together like very, very well. But when you're in the midst of it, like, there might be things you're forgetting about, or this, that, and like they're just throwing things at you. And there were often times that I felt attacked, and I had physical responses to being attacked. And I was like, I need to leave. I need to leave. And their response was either you don't care or you're abandoning me. This is not okay. Like, you can't possibly leave. And I'm like, I'm leaving because you've triggered me in a very physical way, and I need to dissipate that. And in many cases, when you dissipate the initial emotion of a thing, like even just for like a few minutes, you walk away, you breathe, you let your heart rate come down. You're like, this is not nearly as big a deal as I thought it was. I love you. I hear what you're saying. I would like to be able to move forward with this. Let's find a solution. If you stay in those moments, you are much more likely to be hurtful and awful to each other. And so you have to find ways to argue in a constructive way. And then learned, and in my next relationships, often tried to find time and space to be able to do that. Often tried to find physical ways where, like, you can be non-threatening. So like in many cases, if I want to have what I know is a hard conversation, I'm going to sit down on the floor. And
Mm.
the reason why is, like, I'm grounded to the floor. I'm a big man. Like, I'm like 6'2" and I'm pretty strong. And so like I'm grounded to the floor. I'm down here. Even if I get upset, like, I'm here in the most non-threatening way that I can choose. I can
Mm.
actively choose to like keep my voice lowered. There's lots of stuff out there about having hard conversations and better ways to do it. And your tone of voice and the loudness of your voice and how you speak to people and your phrasing on questions is really useful too. But yeah, that was a big thing where as a kid, I had no idea how to go about doing this stuff. And I had one instance where I was ashamed by how I reacted. And I talked to my partner after that, and I was like, we can't do that ever again. Like, that is so not okay. And I need you to understand why.
Mm.
So yeah, that was really challenging. And I think that men in general, like, no one teaches you how to deal with this level of conflict with somebody that you're in love with. Like, you learn it via reactiveness through your parents, and then, your friends, and then maybe your early romantic relationships. But being intentional about how you do that is really important, because it will give you much better ways to resolve conflict that you will have for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I agree. And it's the analogy of sometimes used with this is like, imagine you're a firefighter and you roll up to a building that's on fire. Well, if you get scared and run away, then you're no good in that situation. But if you just run in without paying attention to what's going on, then you're also doing a very dangerous thing. You need to think about what's going on here. So when there's conflict, having an intentional approach to it, kind of taking the lie of the land, and being honest with yourself about whether you're actually in a position to engage right now is a really big part of it. And there are lots of couples counseling techniques as well, where some couples counselors will make couples hug when they're getting into it, or stop and say a nice thing to one another. If you can do those things, that's great. But ultimately, it's all aiming at the same stuff, right? Which is, remind yourself that you are not in a fight to the death against somebody you hate. That's really hard to feel in the moment, but if you can feel it, then it's an enormous part of the battle figured out.
Well, and then it's also about sussing out when, compromise is not possible. Like, there'll
Mm-hmm.
be times where you're like, okay, we've done everything that we could on this, and it's not going to
Yeah.
go anywhere. And in big relationships, that's really tricky. And sometimes, only time sort of heals the wounds, and distance, and that's shit. But like times when you've got somebody that has to be involved in your life, like they're the parent of your children, or
Mm.
your family to some extent as well. You're like, okay, well, you know, I'm going to talk to you about this gently in the future, and I'm going to, make a note of it. But unfortunately, I just realized that this isn't productive for us, and like it's super not productive for me. So I've got to leave that at arm's length. I think those are often really, really hard, because if you have certain personality archetypes, like you're very tenacious about wanting to maintain these relationships and maintain love and in very positive ways. But if
Mm.
somebody else isn't there, like, it takes two people to do this. And if they've already exited, or can't find a way to get back to the positive compromise of not having two truths, of trying to only have one truth, about
Mm.
seeing people with the benefit of the doubt. I think that was something I should have mentioned earlier. The benefit of the doubt is so, so crucial. And it's crucial in
Mm.
every facet of your life. Being offended is a choice. It is not a reaction. Being
Mm-hmm.
offended is a choice. If you are offended by things that people say regularly to you, one, you might be an asshole. But two, you're choosing to take that perspective on what's being told to you. Like, somebody can say anything about me, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. Like, I don't have to take advice from you. Like, you have no impact on my life. I could choose to be offended. I could choose to be a dick. I had an interaction with somebody on the internet today, and they said something that I thought was really close-minded about a player. And it said that they were in sort of the football space. And my response to them was like, you might have some things that you need to learn here because of reasons. And I didn't say that much. And then, like, they chose to think that I was belittling their work and being offensive. And I'm like, look, I'm actually giving you career advice. Like, if you want to continue in this path, I've hired tens, hundreds of people, in fact, in the football space. And not only that, but I've given strategic guidance and advice and tactical advice on how to construct recruitment scouting departments. And so if you were to say that type of thing and you want to be involved in football and someone saw it, like that's a red flag for them in hiring you. I'm not being
Mm.
offensive to you at all. I'm actually trying to give you good, useful advice in your life. But if you chose to be offended, then maybe you're like, oh, well, I'm gonna keep a hold of that. Like that's a chip on my shoulder forevermore. I'm gonna be right in these ways. And I'm like, honestly, plenty of times if somebody, older than you is trying to give you advice, it's at least worth reflecting on. It doesn't mean they're right,
Mhm.
but you can't reflect on it if you're just immediately against, if you feel like you're being attacked. And so having a mindset that's a little more open is really important. And that's true, in all of your life. Like there are plenty of times where I want honest feedback from my partner about how I made them feel or
Mhm.
what made them react in that way. And sometimes they don't know. I think those are like the really challenging ones. I'm like, man, you're angry at me right now. You want to tell me about it? And they're like, no, I'm not angry at you. Fine. Like,
Mm.
okay, well, I don't know what you're irritated about, but your body language, which I read almost perfectly because we've been together for a long time, says this. And in fact, sometimes I see it happen, right? Like I'll say a phrase in my past and like you look at your partner and you just immediately see their body language change. And then they're not honest with you about like their thoughts or their opinions about that. And oftentimes you don't know the source and they don't necessarily know the source of what that is. But finding ways to absorb that honesty and that level of opinion helps you create more of a one truth, helps you find the compromise, helps you, be against the general problem as a pair. And if you don't do that, it often leads to dissolution. It leads to needing to go your separate ways because you can't find the commonality that's required to sustain a relationship.
Mm. And this is where I'd bring it back to something you were saying earlier about being honest with oneself and trying to develop that unshakable core, because then it becomes much easier to take criticism and not to feel like it really has an effect on your value as a person. You can take it, you cannot take it. Someone can be wrong about you and it's okay. It just makes it much easier to go through life without feeling like you need to correct the world, or at least in theory it does. It's a difficult thing to do, but it's worth practicing. It's the work of a lifetime.
And, you know, if you have a tough breakup, like some people who you love deeply will occasionally say some hateful shit about you. And
Mm.
that doesn't mean it's true, but because they're inside the trust wall or because you want them back inside of your life, like you will listen to that and you will give that way more credit than it deserves. If you have a center and you have like a list of your quality traits and how you want to be in life and you have all this evidence in the background that says that actually I am here, maybe this instance this was bad, but like you can't tear me down completely no matter the fact that
Hmm.
I love you, because I know that that's not entirely true. And that might be because you're triggered or because you're hurt. And sometimes years later, like you can come back to those people if they stay in your life and they're like, oh God, I was in a bad place or I said these things and I'm sorry about that because I didn't mean that. I think you're actually this wonderful person in this way. But you could just be buried for years. Some people have breakups that affect them for ages, right? And that's a tough
Hmm.
way to go through life, and it impacts all your other future relationships and stuff like that. So it's really important to develop a sense of self identity and self worth, and we'll probably talk about that lots in the future. In these ways, we're kind of talking about it first through being more honest about yourself and also finding ways to interact more honestly with the world. And then the second thing that I found sort of quite challenging is how I didn't realize how important it was and what was actually happening. I was never intentional about being thoughtful in these relationships and creating sort of one truth and finding us against the problem. Like I knew that I was compromising, I knew that
Mm.
this, but I only saw it when we got into sort of the end stages and there wasn't even necessarily conflict, there was just doneness. And so
Mm.
your reality is this and my reality is that, and I'm like, I'm trying to find the one objective reality for us to then go off of this and be able to interact in a positive way. And you just find that it's not possible because they don't want it to be, or you don't want it to be.
Mm. But I'm not going to say it's easier than to agree to separate, but at least you know that you've done what can be done.
That particular feeling, I think, is the most important in almost every single phase of your life. If you're in a challenging situation,
Mm.
have you done the most that is in your agency to be able to do? Have you
Yeah.
gotten to a spot? So for some reason, when I was a kid, I had a really big sense of right and wrong. And I think my son actually has this too. Like he like very, very clear sense of like, I did something right or something wrong. Some people are
Mhm.
much more fluid about it. And, finding ways to sort of walk through the world feeling like you're doing as much right and as much good as possible. For some reason, like my brain believes in that. Some people are super fungible. Like, how do I get what I want?
Mhm.
I'm like, I don't really think that way. I think that I want to find the most correct way to be honest and good to people of the world. And, again, that's why we have this podcast, which is very, honest. It's not the incel, the red pill, the horrible maleness of like many of the other podcasts. This is literally what many of our listeners wanted us to create, something that was anti that, so that they had a North Star to be able to talk about that. And so for whatever reason, I think that there is a lot of right and wrong. And if I wound somebody that I care about, if I make a mistake, like I feel like I want to be as apologetic as I can be, and can I find ways to make it right? But at some point, like, people don't have to accept your apology.
Mm.
That is on them. It's not on you. And this is the relationship. There's always two entities there, and the two have to be in cooperation. But for yourself, you can't try this forever, right? Like you can't just sort of throw yourself up against the wall over and over and over again, even
Yeah.
though that might be some dark cycles for some of us from our childhood. You have to get to a point where you're like, look, I did everything that I could, and now I have to put this away. And
Mhm.
that's a really hard spot to get to. And sometimes it takes months of work, but it's always there. You always reach that spot.
Yeah.
Well, if you have enjoyed this conversation today, and it just goes where it goes. So, if we didn't get to something that you thought was important in these particular topics, like let us know in the comments.
Mhm.
Patrick and I are having like very open, honest conversations about some very challenging things in life. Yeah. So thank you so much for listening. If you like us, please subscribe and tell all of your friends, 5-star reviews wherever you can, and continue listening, because we've got some pretty interesting stuff coming up. I think, I don't know exactly what order we're going to release these in, because we record these ahead of time, often a couple weeks ahead of time. So we've got a nice little inventory. But I know we're going to start talking about sex. We definitely have some dating stuff. We will make fun of me and my profiles on dating apps.
Mhm.
That's certainly going to happen. Why not make fun of me? I'm easy target. And thank you for listening. Goodbye, everybody.
A third podcast which has the B-roll for this podcast.
Yeah.
We
So
just
go
like
ahead and ask
rushing
your question. Ask your question again.
matryoshkas all the way down.
Yeah. Turtles.
Are you enjoying decorating a house from scratch? Because I thought that would be fun.
It makes me sad,
Mhm.
partly because I think I rented this house, and I looked to buy a house, and the housing market's really crazy here. But I rented this house wanting to be a home for like a family, and
Mm.
and I've always decorated houses with a partner, like pretty much
Sure.
always. And the weird part about my life for the last couple years is that like for my first 20 plus, like almost 25, like I had lived with somebody. So like from ages 20 to yeah, 45, 46, I had lived with someone, and that
Yeah.
was my norm. And so like it's been a lot. And this in particular, like I am enjoying it. So I'm not saying that I'm not enjoying parts of it, but also when I think about it in that context, it does make me sad.
Mm. I get that. That's strange though that you've. I don't
That I'm
know.
an old monogasaur.
Yeah, kind of. Like, I mean,
Mm.
you've not had. Look, I don't want to imply that like you're kind of imprisoned in a relationship, but like you haven't had total autonomy as an adult in how you want to live, like for a long time.
Sure, but I was very willing to trade off that element for
Hmm.
partnership and friendship and love and sex. And so like that seemed like a very natural, warm trade-off. And then when you do that really young, and then you come to your next one and very quickly decide that you want to have children together.
Yeah.
So that was like very chemical, but also we had a great friendship and a great partnership. And the thing that you learn, at least in my experience in the old ways, is that I had two marriages with people that I was friends with for like 8 to 12 months ahead of time. And so we didn't start
Hmm.
dating until we knew each other quite well. And that's a much easier way to get involved. And that's actually like a
Sure.
great kickoff to the whole dating conversation that we're going to have for an episode. This, for those of you following on the B-roll, this is pre our conversations on all the above.
Yeah, I don't know where we are in like our time scale here, I guess.
We're
But
very fluid. We're fluid in time. That's right.
we are fluid. That's an episode. Yeah, I did see though that you clearly were listening to your heart though, because you got a massive fuck off TV
Yeah.
and a
And
massive sound system.
and a real fucking sound system for the first time in my life. I've gotten a sound bar before, but I'd never like gone serious about it. And obviously, it helps to have a very nice payout from selling your business. So, yeah, I mean, and the best thing about this place, so England's very challenging to live in, as you know. Like, most people might not, but England has flatlined for growth and wages for basically a decade. It's a dead decade, and we don't know when and if that's going to come back. So it's a tough place to live. It's dark for basically 4 months out of the year, which is stupid. But my kids are here, and my kids are genuinely like the best part of my life right now, and maybe forever, hopefully. Although like I won't have them for that long, so wanted to be with the kids, and basically in order to do that and not want to travel all the time and not have the exhaustion for wanting to travel towards sun all the time, I had to find a place that I wanted to wake up in and could be happy every day. And so if you see me posting the views on my social channels, which I will do pretty regularly, because I like to say good morning. I feel like a good morning photo, and I don't know, I just think it's cool. But yeah, that's usually out my back garden in this awesome valley that runs through the edge of Bath.
It's kind of it's nice though that I think probably for a lot of Americans, like when they imagine moving to the UK, they do actually imagine Bath. Bath is like the one place in the UK that looks the way that you might expect from costume dramas.
It's true. And if you ever go to Dublin, you're like, what the fuck is this? This is so industrial. Like, this is a city where people work all the time. But the Irish Tourist Board in America is very, like, they spend a ton of money getting these old Irish, people that have Irish blood in them to come back to Ireland and spend money as tourists. And Ireland looks nothing like Dublin, but that's the thing that they sell. So you go to Dublin naturally because that's the airport that you land in. And then in order to see the Emerald Isles, as it were, you got to get out of Dublin.
Yeah, you got to get out to like the southwest or something. Yeah. I don't know. I always kind of think it's strange to me that there's Paris syndrome, but there isn't like UK syndrome, because I do think the UK is.
What's Paris syndrome?
Okay, so this is a phenomenon. I believe that it's specific to Japanese tourists, but I might be getting that wrong. So people will go to Paris and will kind of have an emotional breakdown because they're so disappointed in what Paris actually is. Which is interesting to me because like I adore Paris.
Do you speak French fluently?
I wouldn't say fluently. No.
Do you enjoy people being spectacularly fucking rude to you in restaurants?
People don't do that anymore in Paris.
That is untrue. I have been there twice in the last 2 years. I was there with attractive women who spoke French fluently, and they could tell that they weren't Parisian and they weren't actually French, and they were fucking rude. So I understand that your perspective is that way, but
I was going to say, the thing is, the French are very proprietorial about French as a language. They're very nationalistic about this. And so, I have a friend who's Canadian. She goes there, she speaks Canadian French, and they're like, look at this fucking hillbilly. Yeah. Whereas I don't know, like my wife and I have been I've gone to Paris every year except one for the last 11 years. And we spent our sabbatical there. We spent a couple of months there. We spent a lot of time there, and people are just never rude to me, man. Okay. I don't get it. Whether I speak French or English, they don't mind.
I'm not saying in bulk, but I've certainly had it as a semi-common thing. And also, like, the thing that I was shocked by was like, she just like bombarded us with French. And then eventually the person that, could speak French was doing it. But I was like, she's like, oh, you go ahead and order. Like, what you like the wines, everything like that. So the person that I was with, like, let me take the lead. And man, she's just like unrelenting and like, you can't understand anything. And I just then looked over. I was like, you're going to have to take this one because I'm not getting there.
I think it's an older person, younger person thing though. So like if you get the older Parisians, then they are still just like, what are you doing in our
probably
city?
45, 50 years old.
Whereas I think younger people are much more
worldly.
Yeah, and like they're interested in British and especially American culture, right? So they kind of don't give it. Plus, I think for a lot of younger people, this was an interesting thing. Like when I was studying French in Paris during my sabbatical, one of my teachers weirdly had been an au pair when she was young in exactly the part of London that I'm in, and she said, "Oh, for me, it was like total release to go to London because this was the '90s, and in Paris there is the kind of tyranny of the chic, right? So it's like
Hmm.
very limited palette of colors. You're expected to dress in a kind of sober way
Hate
that's
it.
glamorous but quiet,
London
right?
Underground is the same way, and I rebelled against that when I was working at Brentford as well. I was like, why the
Mm-hmm.
fuck is every single thing gray, black, or brown?
Yeah,
Like
or navy.
I came from Curacao where like we have all the colors and it's very Dutch and like
Yeah,
this is a real thing. And actually this is a common trend in the world, right? You're seeing the world become more muted.
yeah. I mean, and I think in Paris, in Paris as well, it has the really uncomfortable element of Paris is this kind of two-tier city, right? So
Yeah.
what we call Paris is just the central part of Paris, the
Yeah.
20 arrondissement. And then actually the majority of people live in the banlieue, in the suburbs. And the suburbs are overwhelmingly North African and black.
Mhm.
And so this idea that like the center of Paris is going to be chic, it's going to be navy, it's going to be black, cream, brown, like that does feel like a sort of French protectionism, right? Against the influence specifically of like of African culture,
Yeah, because
basically.
African culture is bright and loud.
Yes. So this is the thing. There's this two-tier thing, and this woman said to me when I went to London, I would go to Camden or Brixton or
Oh yeah.
whatever, and people would dress however the fuck they wanted, and nobody cared, and it was totally normal. And for me, going there from Paris, that felt like this huge kind of release. And I think younger people in Paris now feel a bit that way as well. Like
Well,
there's so,
so
so much
a,
more color.
a decade ago, I went to speak to PSG for the first time about bringing data on board and also about set pieces. And
Mm,
so, like, I got to go to their offices, you know, very, very fancy schmancy things. And then that night, I went to a place that's since closed. I think it closed during the pandemic, but it was called Saturn. And it was all about new wave French wine. And it was all
cool.
about the rejection of all of the old French stoic, this is how we do wine, this is what it's called, blah, blah, blah.
Mm,
And they're like, we have great grapes, and the rest of the world has done so many interesting things with this stuff. Let's just break out of that way. And so the only wines that they served were these new wave French wines. They were delicious, obviously, because wine can be delicious in all sorts of different varieties and packages. I think Paris is fine, and I've been there some very nice ones, and I'd love to run along the Seine. But I also think that it's quite a challenging place, and I can certainly understand the
mhm.
Japanese people's perspective on that as well.
Well, yeah, because you arrive and you expect to see like kind of beautiful, clean streets, and I would say that Paris is like paved like 50% in dog shit, which you've just got to accept. You've just
It's
got to
gotten
deal with
worse
it.
because everybody got dogs during the pandemic. So now,
You've just got to accept it. You know, it's the way it is. But like, I don't know. I just think that any big city, whatever people try and characterize
yeah.
a big city as something, I think, oh, that's like a country perspective
Mm.
because any big city contains everything. And for that reason, I think that Paris is much more similar to London, is more similar to New York than they are to the small villages in their respective countries, right?
Yeah, because they're cities. I mean, I think the Asian cities are their own entity. I think that they are also quite overwhelming. For those of you who've never traveled to Asia, so I went to Beijing in 2005, so
Mm-hmm.
before the Olympics, and that place was you couldn't get around without a translator if you were a non-Chinese speaking person. It was basically impossible. There was no way that they had anglified it enough to make it that way. I went to Japan like 11 times in 3 4 years, 4 years while I was covering Magic tournaments, and I got to
Mm-hmm.
get really comfortable there. But the first two times I went for like 5 and 7 days, and I had the most ridiculous headache in like the last day or two that alleviated when I got on the airplane and people started speaking English to me, because you are
Wow.
bombarded with so much stimuli that you can't understand, like linguistic or written or whatever. And it's just like it was so overstimulating, and my brain wanted to process all of it. And eventually you're like, oh, that's where that mental weight is. That's been painful.
That's really interesting because like when I went to Japan, like I found like I really love Kyoto, but in Osaka and Tokyo, where people kind of say they have that experience, I felt completely relaxed and at home and found it really easy, but I've lived in urban places my entire life.
I'm not
So
saying
do
I
you
didn't
think,
love it. I loved it, and I also love cities,
but
but my brain was just struggling to process.
yeah, but that I think is something that I've heard before. And I've often heard it from people who grew up in more rural places.
I
So I
did
was
grow
wondering
up
if
in
it's
the
a holdover
fucking
from that.
country. It's true. But at that
Hmm,
point, I had lived in and around cities for quite a long time.
sure.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. I was going to say one more thing before we actually get on with the real podcast. You mentioned Camden Town and Brixton. So the Brentford Smart Odds offices for the betting syndicate that I used to work with, and where Brentford sort of put their smart team, I guess, was in Kentish Town.
Hmm.
And Kentish is just north of Camden, and so we'd go down and have some food occasionally or whatever. And it's a very cool kind of place, and it's actually sort of closer than Brixton is to central London. It's a great place to be, but it like has cool vibe, and it has like
Hmm.
non-London vibe as well. Shoreditch, I think, is the place that has sort of like the Brooklyn-esque of London at this point, although that keeps moving out too. Like Hackney's like way out there, but still pretty cool. Anyway, at the time, I was like, oh, I like this place. This place is cool. It feels like it's got a great vibe. It doesn't feel quite as stuffy as London is. And then you go to Bristol and you realize that Bristol is basically Camden Town that's grown up into a big sprawling city.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of the experience that I have there. I quite like Bristol too. Yeah, I think that it ebbs and flows, but it's a good place.
Yeah, Bristol, Brighton, those are the places that I think have that kind of energy. My wife and I have always said we'll probably end up in Brighton if we stay in the country. But we'll
I've
see.
only met gay couples from Brighton who hit on me at the bar.
Yeah, but that's great.
Hmm?
I would love to go somewhere where I'm hit on at a much higher rate. That would be fantastic.
It was absolutely lovely. I got their phone number. They said anytime you want to come down, look us up. We'll go have dinner. They were sweet. I'm not gay. Again, it's a compliment. Much like I was dating somebody before, and they said, "I think you would make a spectacular drag queen." And I was like, "That is genuinely one
Oh,
of the best compliments I've ever heard."
yeah. What were the characteristics that they thought would work well for this?
I think we're going to leave it there and let people come back to
Mm,
another episode.
well, that's disappointing. But look, I always found that when I was in Paris during Pride, that was always the best time to be
Mm,
alive. I would be hit on more. I would come away from it with my self confidence insanely high.
absolutely. You're like the most intelligent, cuddly little cub.
Cheers, babe. That's basically what it was. They were like, "You're straight. You're a challenge." Like,
Yes.
we're gonna go and hit on this guy, and it was like a fucking Aesop's fable where like three guys were like, "Oh, we're gonna all like hit on this guy." And I
I
am an attention seeker, so I enjoyed it.
absolutely. In college, my friends all agreed that I was the most likely amongst them to be gay. They did not realize that two
Okay.
women who were going to get married would then turn into lesbians that lived in San Francisco together, but were not dating each other. Fascinating.
That was interesting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
All
All
right.
right, all
On with the
right.
show.